everyone, it's Brittany. Welcome to the third and final video on how to stay healthy in the winter. And I couldn't be more excited. I think we have such an opportunity to become healthier in the winter, and yet so many people are getting sicker. Now, you might be wondering why a homeopath is talking to you about all of this when this really doesn't have anything to do with homeopathy, but I think disease basically falls into two large buckets. There's what sometimes in homeopathy is called a dynamic disease or a dynamic disturbance. It's this idea that we have diseases that no amount of lifestyle ever gets rid of. Lifestyle might make it slightly less intense, but it doesn't cure the disease. That is very different than, let's say, type 2 diabetes, where you have type 2 diabetes because you just loved your cookies. I mean, I love my cookies too. But, so to me, health and helping people with their health means focusing on both buckets. There's the homeopathy for the stuff that is dynamic or the stuff that lifestyle won't cure. And then there's lifestyle to maintain the health you have or to reduce your symptoms so that treatment is more effective. So if you have rheumatoid arthritis, say, and it gets worse with wheat, then removing wheat is part of your treatment because the homeopathic remedy is going to work better for your arthritis if you're not aggravating it by also having wheat, if that makes sense. I do also want to say, if you have type 2 diabetes and it's because, sugar it's hard to stop eating because sugar can be so addictive in things. The fact that it's hard to stop eating can also be essentially a dynamic illness. So I don't want to make it sound like it's all your fault if you got sick and you've got type 2 diabetes, because health and healing is just so complicated. I think it's hard to say something's ever truly lifestyle because we have a crappy lifestyle for a reason, and sometimes that reason is an underlying health concern. But anyway, so last time we talked about brown adipose tissue, one of my favorite topics, and how we form this magical stuff from exposure. And of course that means we can take a cold walk outside, we can do hot cold showers, but it will help reduce inflammation and maintain heat in the body and burn calories at rest, and who doesn't want that? And then we talked about vitamin D dosing in the first video. Now, so what I thought this time is I'd talk a little bit more about how to individualize your dosages of things. So, as I talked about a little bit with the cold exposure video, if you have a condition that is made worse by cold exposure is not for you. Individualized treatment to me is always paramount. It matters very much what your reaction to cold is. So even though I have said that cold has all of these amazing benefits, if any amount of cold makes you worse, then it makes you worse. Don't keep trying to do cold exposure. Okay? Now, for vitamin D, the reaction is a little bit more delayed, so it's not like you can say, oh, I know I feel crappy after such and such dose of vitamin D. So I always suggest getting your blood levels measured by a professional. It's the best way to know that you're getting the appropriate dose. You can both measure whether or not you can increase the dose a little bit because your blood levels are a little meh, and you can tell whether or not they're getting a bit high. So for special populations as well, so anyone other than an adult, basically, there are some adjustments you can make to the dose. For children, children are a little bit difficult. There's really not great data on children, which is really a shame. But I would dose, so like if you are between, your kids, because I don't imagine a 1-year-old is watching this, like between 1 and 5, let's say, I would dose 1 to 2,000 IU a day. Over 5, you can go like 2 to 4. They're all very approximate because they haven't tested the pediatric population very much, for ethical reasons, obviously. But it's frustrating, right? Of course, ethically, we don't want to make anybody sick by giving them too much vitamin D, but it's also hard to know exactly what's the appropriate dose for kids because there hasn't been a lot of research. Infants, weirdly, it's a bit more clear. 4,000 IU for an infant does seem to be appropriate. And do be careful if you have an infant. rickets is most common in breastfed babes. So make sure if you are breastfeeding that you are getting your kid 400 IU a day. If you are breastfeeding, then the only paper I could find that showed 400 IU of breast milk, essentially, appeared only if the lactating person was taking 6,500 IU a day. Meaning, for me, I think a lactating person should be having at least 6,500 a day, because that means that the baby's going to be getting enough vitamin D through the breast milk. If you're taking less vitamin D, then you really need to be supplementing the baby itself. Okay, and usually for kids and babies, there's drops that you can put into their food so that they don't mind taking it too much. So, overweight persons. This is a bit controversial, so it's a little bit difficult to talk about because it seems like it's more common to be deficient if you are overweight. What's unclear is why. Does it mean they're not taking enough, or does it mean so vitamin D is stored in fat because it's a fat soluble vitamin. So if you are overweight, does it mean you're storing it in your fat and not using it? And people just aren't sure, because then there's this concern that if you lose a lot of weight quickly, all this vitamin D is going to get released into your bloodstream, and then it could be bad. I haven't actually seen any evidence of that happening, but it's a concern. So what I would do if you are overweight and concerned about vitamin D levels is you really need to get them checked, because you really need to make sure that you've got the right amount circulating in your bloodstream. Whether or not that means you need to take more, or if you're losing weight, you need to check if you should be taking less because your blood levels are rising as you're losing weight. Unclear, but again, the best way is to get them tested. All right. So also skin color, because this becomes an issue with vitamin D. There's this thing called the vitamin D paradox, where essentially vitamin D became famous in adults because of osteoporosis. So people used to be given vitamin D to help prevent the progression of osteoporosis because it would increase your calcium, right? And with vitamin D deficiency, you're much more likely to get osteoporosis if you are white, not if you have darker skin. And so some people were like, well, that means that people with darker skin don't need vitamin D. However, vitamin D does not just mineralize your bones. It does a lot of other things. And so I think it's a little silly to say that just because people who are dark don't get osteoporosis, they don't need vitamin D. I mean, they need vitamin D. However, so if anybody tells you, if you have dark skin and anyone tells you that you don't need vitamin D, I would seriously question that person. But the one thing I will say about skin color and vitamin D is the darker you are, the longer it takes you to make vitamin D in the sun. And that's because essentially the dark pigment of melanin is blocking the cells that make vitamin D, and it does that because it's protective, right? Like melanin is basically sunscreen. But what that means is that you need to be in the sun a lot longer in order to make the same amounts of vitamin D as someone who's pale. That wasn't a problem when we lived in Speedos on the equator, but these days it's a problem. Even if you live at the equator, you're wearing clothes, and so it's harder to manufacture enough vitamin D. In northern climates, then, if you are dark-skinned, I would recommend taking vitamin D all year round and taking it a bit on the higher end of the dosing spectrum, because you're not going to be getting as much from your own production. You're going to be getting less than someone who's pale. So I hope that was helpful in clarifying some of the special cases for all of these things. So there's a lot more to talk about with staying healthy in the winter. The sun is a full spectrum thing. We get infrared light, we get different kinds of infrared light, we get visible light, we get red light, and then of course there's the cold issue. And so I am going to talk about all of this live on December the 14th at 8 p.m. EST. All right, so I hope to see you there. I'll be covering all of this in a lot more detail. All right, let me know if you have any questions or comments or you want clarification. I'm always here to help you guys out. So stay healthy and happy. Bye.